Thank you for downloading this edition of the BBC series The Public Philosopher. The programme is presented by Michael Sandel.
Thank you. My name is Michael Sandel. Welcome to this episode of The Public Philosopher. We've done earlier versions of The Public Philosopher in the UK, in the US, and in India. And today we're in the Netherlands at Utrecht University to discuss morality and law, to ask the question, what, if anything, should be the relation between morality and law? Should law embody certain moral judgments and promote them, or is the purpose of law simply to prevent people from doing harm to other people? Now, here in Holland, well, you're famous for being one of the most permissive societies in Europe, maybe in the world. And I'd like to ask you about that. How many people consider Holland to be a liberal society? Raise your hand. Quite a few hands go up. How many don't? Only 3 or 4 people. Well, let's begin with some of the issues on which Holland is famously permissive. Laws about soft drugs, prostitution, and assisted suicide. Let me begin by taking a poll. How many believe that people should be free to use marijuana, cannabis? Raise your hands. Quite a large number of people. How many don't? A handful of people, a couple of dozen. Let's hear first from those who don't. What would be your reasons?
I would say the fact that it leads to an unconscious behavior that can be dangerous for the broader society.
What do you have in mind?
The fact that you can be doing things under altered state of mind, and that can lead to uncontrolled action that can deal to some harm towards the others.
Being stoned.
For instance, I would say that, exactly.
And the bad thing about being stoned, the reason the law should act to prevent it, is that you might drive a car and get into a crash.
Yes, but also the fact that you're doing things that you're not totally responsible for.
So what's your name?
My name is Nelson.
And do you think that being stoned is enough of a vice so that in a decent society we should discourage people getting stoned?
Yes.
Okay, so you have a principled moral objection to permitting the use of cannabis that goes beyond harm to others and even goes beyond health concerns. It's a bad way of being. Mm-hmm. All right, who would like to respond to Nelson's argument?
I don't see how this is any different from alcohol, and that's permitted in the Netherlands.
What about alcohol, Nelson?
I would say that as a moral principle, it should be also discouraged, and I believe it is. For instance, in sports, it's not encouraged to use adverts such as tobacco, such as alcohol. I think that there is a difference between discouragement and making it illegal.
Right.
And law can enhance discouragement, but allowing a substance to be legal.
Aha. So you would discourage both soft drugs and alcohol?
Yes.
What's your name?
Aisha.
Aisha. Now, Nelson has accepted your counterexample and said he's against being drunk as well as being stoned. He thinks neither is a good way to be, and that society should discourage both. What do you say to Nelson?
I think I'm grown enough to know what I'm doing even when I'm stoned. So, I'm sorry. Personally, I think heroin should be admitted as well.
Why should heroin be legal?
Because we're grown-up people.
We've heard a strong defense for even the legalization of heroin in the name of individual liberty. Who disagrees?
Well, I think there are different processes that work with substances like heroin because there's physiological processes that cause addiction, and that's something different from maybe working a very hard job because it's harder to get out of that cycle. And if you start trying heroin for various reasons, part of them might be like peer pressure or being too young to actually see the consequences, then you might be in a cycle of addiction that you can't escape from anymore.
Yes.
So I would definitely disagree with this hedonistic idea about life. Drugs limit your capacity to reason. It is reason that makes people be human beings, so to speak. That's what differentiates from other animals.
Tell us your name.
David.
So, David, you think drugs are dangerous not only because of possible health effects, but because they impair our reason, and our reason is what makes us distinctive as human beings. Would you ban cannabis?
Yes.
And what about alcohol?
I would discourage it.
What do you say, David, to those whom we've just heard from who say, what about individual liberty? What about the freedom to choose?
Well, I think that even when it comes to yourself, you're not allowed to do certain things to yourself. The respect for human dignity prevents us from doing certain things to us.
And so that a person who spends half the day stoned, with reason impaired, is failing to respect his or her own dignity. Thank you for that. All right, David has made an argument in the name of human dignity and respect for human reason to use the law to protect us from ourselves. Yes, tell us your name.
Ramona. Most of the time we're talking about extreme cases where somebody's spending the whole day stoned in their living room. But what about a person that excels really well in society, has good grades, but then once in a while enjoys having a joint? Are they going against their human dignity then? In my opinion, you should be allowed to indulge yourself in certain things. You can make the choice in how you indulge yourself. I mean, that's still respecting yourself because you're giving yourself what you want, especially if you have a stressful life. Why not give yourself a little bit of enjoyment and pleasure in a way that's not exactly what everybody else thinks is good, but what you think is good for yourself?
Right. Who else would like to weigh in on this argument? It seems that there's a debate here between those who prize individual liberty as the highest principle and those like Nelson and David who say, no, the law should try to discourage vice and encourage good ways of being, encourage self-respect.
I don't think it's possible to live a human life, like David was saying, without having a certain amount of excess in your life. I think today's society demands things of you, such an amount of control that you need to go astray and do something excessive once in a while to stay sane to some amount.
That's interesting. What's your name?
Nina.
So you would favor a more permissive approach to drugs, soft drugs, let's say, on the grounds that letting loose, allowing a certain excess, is actually important to the good life, to human flourishing, the very kinds of things that Nelson and David invoke against permitting, say, marijuana.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. What this discussion about drug use has brought out are two different ways of conceiving the relation between morality and law. There are some who have argued that the law should encourage good behavior, good ways of being, and others have said, no, that's not the business of the law. People should be free to decide for themselves what kind of lives to live. And now Nina has said actually one argument for permissiveness, at least with regard to marijuana laws, is a certain vision of the good life that should permit, within bounds, certain moments of excess. I want to shift the example now and see what you think about another issue. What about prostitution? Should people be free to buy and sell sex? How many say yes? And how many say no? The majority say yes. Maybe 15% say no. Let's hear first from those who are in favor of permitting prostitution.
I think that it's actually the same as the other discussion. It's that I do not think that a government should make a moral judgment as such, which is to a large extent arbitrary, especially in the drugs case. However, there is a practical issue with this. At this point, in the Netherlands as well, it's very much correlated with criminal activity and not actually voluntarily selling your own body for sex. So it has to be distinguished here between the idea behind it of completely free will being able to do this and the practical situation in the Netherlands, because I think that there's a big difference here which might have also influenced people's votes to a large extent. The women who are behind the windows, they came to the Netherlands, for example, believing they would be an au pair or in different ways of human trafficking. So I think that in a practical sense, I would not necessarily be in favor of allowing prostitution, because there's a lot of issues that surround it. But as an idea that people should be free to choose to do this, to buy and sell sex, that I would be in favor of.
You'd be in favor in principle, but in practice, you fear that many women are coerced into it or tricked into prostitution. And when you speak of the women in the windows and where they come from, explain what you mean.
When you walk through Amsterdam, for example, I think, and from what I've read, also it's an increasing amount. Really? No, there's an increasing amount, especially now, like with the European Union and more open borders as well, of Eastern European women, for example, who come here, not necessarily knowing that is what they will be doing.
And what's your name?
Boudewijn.
Let's acknowledge that danger and see if we can separate the question of principles. Suppose that regulations could be put in place to prevent that, to protect those who sell sex from coercion, from violence, from threats, and from being brought under false pretenses, such that the consent were truly informed and voluntary. If we imagine that, how many people would be in favor of permitting prostitution? A larger number. I'd like to hear from some of those who would still be opposed. Why would you object?
I would object because I think it's a moral issue to monetize sex. I think it does affect human dignity, and it affects self-esteem and just affects them emotionally, and I just think it's immoral.
Tell us your name.
Arabella.
Arabella says it's a moral issue. Monetizing sex is a moral issue. It's objectionable. It's a violation of human dignity. Who disagrees and has a reply? Yes.
Thank you, Professor Sandel. It sounds like to me, so far your leading questions are ignoring differences between societies to a large extent. To what extent national laws should intervene in the prostitution system? My answer would be it really depends on societies. If in Netherlands, yes, it should be regulated, but in China, it should be forbidden in terms of the social acceptance of such practice.
And you are from?
I'm from China.
So in China it should be banned, and you're here as a student in the Netherlands?
Yes, I am.
But in the Netherlands you think it should be permitted?
I think it should be regulated. It depends on the general psyche on such a practice.
So you think it should just depend on the social mores, the conventions, the customs?
I think it depends on the cultural differences.
I actually argue that because I don't think morality differs within societies. You mean a woman in the Netherlands, if she's a prostitute, that will not affect her human dignity, but in China would. I don't really see your point in it.
I really see difference about the moral values or moral status in different cultures. For example, here, if somebody addresses herself as a sexual worker, I don't think a lot of people just stigmatize that person. But in China, that would be a huge problem.
Yes, I understand your point. I just think it should not be allowed anywhere. I'm pretty sure that every parents that have daughters or maybe even sons, they don't say, oh, I hope she grows out to be a prostitute, or that's every girl's dream somehow.
So even in the permissive Netherlands, few people aspire to that career for their daughter.
So I do think my point stands in that it does affect human dignity, regardless of the society.
All right, thank you for that. Are there objections of principle to Arabella's view? Someone who thinks that there's a right to buy and sell sex if both parties to the agreement decide that it's in their interest, and they come to an agreement on a price. Classic market exchange. Tell us your name.
Chris. Well, thank you for your wonderful point and the debate that it brings. My reply would be that, because we're talking so much about human dignity, is that inside human dignity there is this freedom of choice. Human dignity means that you can decide for yourself how you would treat your body, what you would do with your body, and how you decide with it. So if you, for instance, think, it is my way of life to sell my body for sex, and this is how I want to rule my life, I think it's a part of human dignity that we allow people, if it's fully consensual, to do so.
Great. All right, let me ask Chris a question. Chris raises the interesting point, in reply to those who invoke human dignity in favor of restricting prostitution, Chris says, doesn't human dignity consist in respecting people's free choices, in letting people engage, letting consenting adults make their choices for themselves? And if that's what human dignity means, then we shouldn't restrict people's choices in the name of dignity. To the contrary, we should respect their choices, even the choice to engage in prostitution. May I test your argument with another example, Chris?
Sure.
Have you ever heard of dwarf tossing?
I heard about it once, yeah, that people who are born very small, I forgot the English word, that they toss them around for sports, I believe.
Right, it's a pub game. Who knows about dwarf tossing? Almost everyone here has heard of it. Maybe you've read about it. Who can describe it? Yes.
It is a sport where you throw a dwarf as far as you can.
And it's consensual. The dwarf, or the person of short stature, has various padding on his elbows and knees and wears a helmet. And it's a contest to see who can throw this person the furthest. Now, Chris, what do you think about dwarf tossing?
Well, wouldn't say it would be the best sport ever, but okay, interesting. Yeah, no, but in my moral view, I have to be consistent, of course, and then I would have to say, well, yes, of course, it's allowed, because he consented to it, even if it is a bit outrageous maybe that we would throw people around because they want to, because in another way, it's, of course, a bit humiliating for people to just treat them as being thrown around, even if they're consenting to it. So, yeah, I could say there are, of course, this gray area whereas dwarf tossing is concerned.
So you view it as a hard case.
Exactly.
But you acknowledge that it's humiliating, even though consensual.
Yes, but yeah, on the other hand, if someone wants to be humiliated or does not perceive it in that such, then it's hard to say, no, you can't.
Who has a reply to Chris?
I don't actually see it as a humiliation. Because if some dwarf or little people decides to be a part of this sport, he might be very proud of the way he flaunts in the air and gets further or something like that. I don't know. It's talking about human dignity. I think you have the right to choose. And if people think they can be the furthest thrown dwarf, well, be my hero.
And what's your name?
Tamara.
You suggest that dwarf tossing is an activity in which people can excel, and I'm sure that's true, but I'm not sure the people who can excel at it are the people being thrown.
I don't know. I can't imagine.
All right, so Tamara and Chris defend dwarf tossing in the name of freedom of choice, the right of people to decide for themselves what they regard as humiliating. Who believes dwarf tossing should be banned on moral grounds?
I think human dignity is also about respecting contracts. In the case of prostitution, there was consensus and there were regulations so that everyone was fully informed and it was like a beneficial trade. And I don't think that's the case here because you're thrown around. There's all sorts of health risks And you can't possibly know what those consequences will be when your job is actually being thrown around. So I think in that way, the contract isn't really respected. It's slightly coercive, I think, and therefore it's morally objectionable. So.
And what's your name?
René.
Have you ever watched rugby, René?
Yes.
What about rugby?
Well, in that sense, I would also say morally, I think it's objectionable. Yeah. In practice, of course, it's fun to watch. So.
Right. So René has worries that the consent might not be fully informed. But here again, to get at that issue of principle, let's imagine that there were a regulatory system to assure informed consent for all participants in dwarf tossing, and that there were health and safety regulations, adequate padding, let's say, and helmets of a certain character. Now, just to get to this issue of consent, the moral weight of consent, would it be all right then, René?
Yeah, if both parties are fully informed and such, yes, then I would think it's okay.
The person in the red sweater.
I think we should take this principle farther, because we are leaving aside a really important part of it, that it's money. Money is involved. So I don't think in these examples the consensus is really working, because in the end they do it for money, so you could say they're coerced by money. If there would be a consensus that didn't involve money, if they did it just for fun, then I think it would be like people could not have anything against it.
This is an interesting suggestion. What's your name?
Joel.
You say that even if the consent were fully informed, and even if there were regulations about the helmets and the padding, we would still have to ask whether this is a truly voluntary choice.
Yes.
Because the people who engage in it may desperately need the money.
Yes.
Then the choice may not truly be voluntary. Is that the worry?
Yes.
You'd apply that, would you, to dwarf tossing and also to prostitution?
Yes.
Well, now that's an interesting argument. It's an argument for banning paid prostitution, not on the grounds that prostitution is intrinsically degrading, but instead on the grounds that the choice isn't truly voluntary in the case, at least, of those who desperately need the money. Let's go back to the dwarf tossing. If money were not involved, and this were simply a sport with no money changing hands, then it would be different.
Yes.
Would it be less humiliating for the person hurled across the room?
I think so. It's his choice to be thrown.
Thank you. I think morality assumes that there are people living together. So morality presumes a society. And I think society is based on solidarity, personal integrity and such. So therefore everything that threatens those is threatening society and therefore immoral. And that's, I think, the distinction between dwarf tossing, which is humiliating, discriminating, and rugby, which is fun and less dividing for society.
So rugby supports social solidarity, whereas dwarf tossing erodes it.
Exactly, yes.
What about that?
Thank you. I feel that the examples of condemning, let's say, prostitution and dwarf tossing on the basis of human dignity somewhat overly limit the definition of what human dignity is. I don't think it's that objective. For example, we all here think it would go against our dignity if we didn't wear clothes. Some tribes in South America would disagree. Human dignity is also dependent on respecting someone's personal choice. So when we go and say, I do not think that you have the right to do something that I condemn, I feel that also goes against human dignity. So these people might get, in my opinion, some more freedom, some more respect to do what they want, even if we condemn it.
And what's your name?
Laurie.
Now, Laurie, you began by suggesting that human dignity was a subjective matter that varies person to person, culture to culture, but then you made the different point that human dignity means respecting people's choices. Do you assert that second principle as a universal principle, that human dignity always means respecting people's choices?
I would make two assumptions here. First, that the consent is actually informed and given willingly, and secondly, that the exercise of that doesn't infringe on the rights of others. If those two conditions are met, then yes.
And therefore, provided the consent is informed and truly voluntary, you would favor permitting dwarf tossing, you would favor prostitution?
I would say I do not have the right to tell a dwarf that they cannot fly if...
Here. We've heard from a number of people, Chris, Tamara, and Lori. I wonder if the three of you could stand up, and we'll get each of you a microphone. I want to put to you another case to test the argument that each of you has made that human dignity should not be invoked to restrict people's choices. To the contrary, respecting human dignity means letting people choose for themselves. Some years ago in Germany, there was an unusual case of consensual cannibalism. Did you read about it, anyone? Almost everyone read about it. Who can give us a quick summary of the case? Yes.
Thank you. In Rothenburg, a city in southern Germany, two men agreed that one will eat the other, and they made a contract. It was consensual, they said, and then one actually ate the other. But I know that there was a movie made about it. It was banned in Germany. I'm German, that's why I'm aware of that.
And actually the case did go to trial, and the courts were confounded about how actually to deal with this case, and in the end the man was sentenced. But we're interested here in the question of principle. So I want to put this case of consensual cannibalism with informed consent to those who have argued that respecting human dignity means respecting individual choice. Tamara, what do you say?
I really don't see the problem because they both agreed on it. So why should we interfere?
Who has a reply? Yes.
I would disagree with this argument on the grounds that in this case the consent is not informed, because the person who gets eaten, you don't know what death is like. You know what life is like, and you know how it's like to have sex if you're a prostitute, but you don't know what death is like, so it's not an informed choice.
My name is Tan. Well, this is the case in a lot of the examples. You don't know what it's like to do hard drugs. You don't know what it's like to be a prostitute. But I have a problem with taking the choice away. I mean, you choose to experience that, even if it's maybe the last thing you experience.
Well, the difference here is that if you choose to experience the prostitution or the drugs, that you still stay alive afterwards, and then you can value your experience later on and choose not to do it again. But once you're dead, you don't have that choice anymore.
Yeah, I think another issue should arise, and namely whether we should protect human dignity or not. Definitely, I think it's really questionable when someone agrees it's consensual that they get killed and eaten by someone. And I think we should protect them as a society, and I don't think that should be allowed. And as well, I would take that point further on to prostitution. Again, we should protect human dignity.
You say, Arabella, that consent is not enough. Respecting human dignity may sometimes require that
protection.
We protect people even from their own choices.
Yes.
All right, let me go back to, is it David? David, what do you say to this argument? What it means to respect human dignity is simply to let people do what they want, assuming it's truly informed voluntary consent.
So I just think that people, when they act because of their needs, it doesn't mean that their action has a moral value. For example, the one that goes for prostitute, he's acting because he needs, well, arguably some sexual need, but yeah, let's say there exists a sexual need, and he acts because of that need, but that action doesn't have a moral value to it. It's like going to eat something. I don't attach moral value to it. When I act truly in a free way, I act without thinking to my needs. I'm acting because of reason, so to speak.
You've given a good account of what Immanuel Kant would say to those who conceive individual choice based on wants and needs as the highest moral principle. He would say, as you've said, David, that simply acting out of our contingent needs and desires, whatever they may be, is not the way to the moral life. It's not the way to respecting human dignity. The way to respect human dignity is to act out of reason, which is something apart from our contingent desires and needs. And if Kant is right, and if David is right, then there is a difference, after all, between human dignity on the one hand and doing what we want on the other. Who would like to reply to that argument in the very back, with wearing glasses?
I would say that there are two different principles at stake, and that simply because the action itself is not something one should do doesn't mean that society should not allow him to do that. For society, the highest principle would be to respect people's dignity by letting them do what they want to do, even though we might think that one should not kill himself or have someone kill them, because that's not the right thing to do. But for society as a whole, it's the right thing to do to let people decide whatever they want to do, even though that choice might not be right.
So society should not embody in the law moral judgments about right and wrong behavior. It should let people do even bad things so long as they don't hurt other people.
Yes.
What do you say?
Dear liberals, I'd say that this value of liberty becomes inconsistent as soon as you promote cannibalism or even you tolerate cannibalism. In the end, the whole value of liberty that you put forward is gone because you're dead.
Would you say the same of dwarf tossing?
If you throw hard enough, yes.
But only if it involves death.
That's an absolute.
Let's take a case that involves death, that is much debated in our societies. The question of assisted suicide. And let's take a poll. How many think that the law should permit people to end their lives when they choose, with the help of others if need be? Quite a strong majority say yes. Let's hear from those who object, those who think that assisted suicide should not be permitted. Yes?
Well, I found that argument of the man in front, I found it very convincing. There is an absolute point, and that's death, and there stops your experiencing and taking your freedom.
So to take your life is to give up your freedom, even if you choose to do it freely. What do you say?
I think legally, morally, socially, we have the right to life, and I think in order to assert total control and autonomy and possession of your own life, I think to be able to take your own life is the very epitome of having the right to ownership of it.
It's the epitome of the right to own one's own life.
Indeed.
And what's your name?
Zach.
Zach, in a way, the right to commit suicide is, would you say, the highest expression of freedom?
I think so, yeah.
Who disagrees with Zach? Yes, Nelson.
Well, I would say that eventually we do not own totally our lives. Our lives are a part of something bigger that is mankind, and we also have the duty to lead by some kind of example. So if we all agree as a civilization that death is something to be prevented, an individual that decides to put an end to his own life by his free will without any motivation that other people can understand is actually creating an example or a precedent that will question this fundamental value of society. And that, for me, is something that is objectionable.
So, Nelson, you question Zach's claim that we own our own lives, that we're the owners of ourselves?
I believe we are not totally the owners of ourselves. We are a part of a bigger total that is mankind.
Go ahead.
I would say that the assumption that our actions are reasonable is, to a very large extent, false. I think in many cases, and research has shown that in many cases, we're very bad at predicting what will happen to us. We're very bad at predicting the consequences of our actions. While I like the idea of saying we're some sort of community and therefore our lives are not entirely our own, I would say that the decision whether or not you want to be alive, that should definitely be your own. And I think it is much more morally reprehensible to force people to stay alive, to take away from them the right to decide whether or not they want to be alive.
I think what we've created in this conversation and what we're now constantly reinforcing is a kind of false binary between, on the one hand, this very kind of libertarian conception of individual choice and freedom, and on the other hand, this, to put it mildly, moralistic idea of human dignity. Both are objectionable, and what we've seen is that with the libertarian conception, we're ignoring certain structural imbalances of power, we're ignoring kind of these psychological objections. On that basis, we need to talk about human dignity. But then to make that very moralistic decision, to say, this is human dignity, then my question is, what legitimates that conception of human dignity? I think what legitimates the law is democracy as a whole. If we're talking about human dignity, then we need to ask the question, what creates the legitimacy of this conception of human dignity? And for me, that has to be democracy. It cannot be a religion or some kind of set of values that has no grounding in any kind of social structure.
We've had a fascinating discussion of what the law should be with regard to drug use, selling sex, assisted suicide, and along the way we've considered some other admittedly extreme cases, dwarf tossing and consensual cannibalism. And from this discussion, there emerged really two different conceptions of what a liberal society is and what the role of morality in law should be. We've heard powerful expression of the principle that individual liberty, respect for individual choice, provided it's based on informed consent, uncoerced, is the highest principle that should govern law and society. And others say, no, there are certain cases where the law should not permit individuals to choose for themselves, whether it be to sell sex or to engage in dwarf tossing. Because some practices that people may choose, even with full consent, may be humiliating or demeaning or may fail to respect human dignity. And then we considered the rejoinder to that argument. But what is human dignity if not respect for people's choices? And then we heard a reply from David, drawing on the view of Kant, that said, acting on our choices simply reflects our contingent needs and desires. But why should those needs and desires define our freedom? In many cases, we haven't chosen them. The fact that I prefer one chocolate over vanilla ice cream, that's a desire I have, but I didn't choose that desire. I just happen to have it. All the more so with these more fundamental aspects of human experience. And so the Kantian reply says, autonomy, yes, but autonomy doesn't just mean acting on our desires and needs. Truly to be autonomous, on this view, is to act in accordance with reason, to act in a way that shows respect for human dignity, for the capacity of all humans, to exercise reason. And some choices we make may fail to respect human dignity. It's interesting that these are really two competing principles within the liberal tradition itself. If you go back to two of the most famous founders of liberal political philosophy, John Locke and Immanuel Kant, they both argued for certain restrictions on individual choice in the name of what they saw as the higher, more fundamental freedom. John Locke and Immanuel Kant argued that we don't have a right to commit suicide. Locke, because he said our right to liberty and life are so fundamental that even we can't choose to give them up. And Immanuel Kant was against suicide and against prostitution on the grounds that truly to be autonomous is not to be driven by our desires and wants and needs. It's to act in accordance with reason, and it's to act in a way consistent with our own dignity. Liberalism is often understood to prize above all respect for individual choice. But there's another competing strand within the liberal tradition that says individual choice isn't everything. What really matters is respecting persons as ends in themselves or as the bearers of unalienable rights. And this mode of human respect may require that we rein in certain expressions of individual choice that may amount to indignity. I want to thank all of you here in Utrecht in the Netherlands for joining me for this edition of The Public Philosopher. Thank you very much.
That was The Public Philosopher, presented by Michael Sandel. The producer was David Edmonds.